Once upon a time, in the city of Jerusalem, there was a boy who always listened more than he spoke. His name was John Mark. Though most people just called him Mark, he wasn't a preacher, or a traveler, or anyone particularly brave. At least, not yet. He was the kind of boy who stayed close to the walls and watched the room before stepping inside. He liked quiet places, safe places, places where he didn't have to prove anything. And tonight, he was hiding behind the back door of his mother's house, knees tucked under his robe, ears wide open. It was no ordinary night. Upstairs, the early church had gathered to pray. Word had spread that Peter had been arrested again. Herod had already killed James, and Peter was next. "They're praying for a miracle," Mark whispered to himself. But deep down, he wasn't sure miracles still happened. A loud knock interrupted the whispers. "Peter's at the door," someone cried. The house exploded in shouts, tears, praise. Peter had escaped, walked out of prison like it was nothing. He stood there, alive and smiling, like someone fresh out of a lion's den. Mark stared from behind the curtain. He wanted to cheer, to believe. But part of him, just a small part, was still afraid. Later that night, Peter found Mark helping clean up candle wax and empty bowls. "You've got a good heart, Mark," Peter said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Keep listening for the Lord. He'll use you, if you don't run from him." Mark looked up. "Run?" Peter smiled gently. "Everyone's tempted to run at some point. Just don't let fear write your story." Mark nodded slowly, but the word stuck like a pebble in his sandal. Because even though he wanted to follow Jesus, even though he loved hearing the stories, even though he believed, he still wasn't sure he had what it took. He didn't like danger, or blood, or travel, or speaking in crowds, and he definitely didn't like disappointing people. But he also didn't want to stay behind while everyone else followed Jesus to the ends of the earth. Mark wanted to be part of the story, even if, someday, he would walk away too soon. It had only been a few weeks since Peter's escape, but Mark still heard the knock in his dreams. Some nights he replayed the joy in everyone's faces, the thrill of answered prayer, the sound of hope filling the room. But other nights he heard Peter's quiet words, "Just don't let fear write your story." He didn't know what to do with that. Until one hot afternoon, Barnabas showed up at the door. Mark was sweeping the entryway, lost in thought, when the older man's shadow stretched across the stone floor. "Mark," Barnabas said, smiling under his traveling hood, "I've got a question for you." Mark blinked. "Yes, sir?" Barnabas stepped inside and pulled a small satchel from his side. "Paul and I are leaving soon. Antioch first, then wherever the Spirit sends us." Mark's heart skipped. To preach? To preach, to teach, to plant churches. Maybe get beaten a few times, Barnabas added with a wink. Mark gave a nervous laugh. "But we need someone young. Someone who can carry scrolls, take notes, help the people. I thought of you." Mark's mouth opened, then closed. "You want me to come?" "You're ready," Barnabas said gently. "And besides, your mother already said yes." "What?" "She said you've been pacing the house and praying like a man twice your age. You want in, Mark. Don't deny it." Mark felt a strange mix of fear and fire in his chest. He did want in, but could he really do it? "I'm not like you," Mark said quietly. "Or Paul. You two speak with fire. You walk into cities like you own them. I get nervous reading out loud." Barnabas smiled. "Then you'll have something in common with Moses." Mark looked down. "What if I mess everything up?" "You will," Barnabas said, completely serious. We all do. But God doesn't waste it, and He doesn't leave us. Mark nodded slowly, unsure if he believed it, but wanting to. So that night, Mark packed a bag. It wasn't much, a few changes of clothes, a scroll or two, a slingshot from his boyhood, and before dawn he left the safe streets of Jerusalem behind. The next morning, the sun blazed over the coast of Caesarea as Mark followed Paul and Barnabas onto a wooden ship. Waves slapped the sides. Wind whipped his robe. "Too late to turn back now," Paul said with a grin, pulling the ropes tight. Mark smiled faintly, but something in his stomach churned. He wanted to believe he was ready. But deep down, the question still lingered. What if I'm not? The boat rocked so hard, Mark thought it might break in half. Waves slammed the sides, sending up bursts of sea spray that soaked his face and made his teeth chatter. Paul stood near the mast, legs wide for balance, completely unfazed by the storm. Barnabas looked relaxed, too, humming a tune while tying scrolls with calm, steady fingers. But Mark gripped the edge of a wooden crate with both hands, eyes locked on the horizon, praying the olives he'd eaten that morning wouldn't come back up. "Not what you expected, huh?" Barnabas said with a grin. Mark shook his head and mumbled, "I didn't know following Jesus meant nearly losing your lunch at sea." Barnabas laughed. "You'll get used to it." He wasn't so sure. When they finally reached Cyprus, Mark's legs were so wobbly from the ship that he nearly kissed the rocky shore, but there was no time to rest. The city of Salamis was loud and full of motion. Foreign words flew through the air like flocks of birds, and the synagogue where they preached was already packed with people by the time they arrived. Paul preached with power, like a hammer made of words. He quoted scripture with such force that even the religious leaders leaned in to listen. Barnabas followed with stories of Jesus that made the crowd smile, then weep, then sit in complete silence. Mark sat in the back, clutching a rolled-up scroll like a life raft. He wasn't doing much, just watching, holding things, trying not to trip. But somehow he felt like he was standing in the middle of something huge and terrifying. Afterward, a man clapped him on the back and said, "Good work, young helper." Mark gave a tight smile and nodded, but inside, a little voice whispered, "You're not helping. You're hiding." Their next stop was the city of Paphos, and that's where everything changed. They were invited to speak with Sergius Paulus, the Roman governor, a high-ranking man with silk robes, golden chains, and guards that didn't blink. Mark followed Barnabas and Paul into the stone halls of the palace, his eyes darting to every armored soldier they passed. He kept the scrolls pressed tightly to his chest, like maybe they'd protect him. "Just stay close," Barnabas whispered. "I don't plan on going anywhere," Mark whispered back. But the moment Paul began to speak, they were interrupted. A man stepped in, tall, dressed in layers of black and silver, with rings on every finger and a smirk that made Mark's skin crawl. His name was Elymas. "A pleasure, Governor," Elymas said smoothly, "but I must warn you, these men bring foolishness, myths, and dreams wrapped in holy talk." Mark took an uneasy step back as Elymas turned toward them, eyes sharp. "You're confusing him," Elymas said. "He doesn't need stories about a dead carpenter." Paul's whole posture shifted. He walked straight toward the magician, stopped just a foot away, and spoke in a voice so calm it cut deeper than shouting. "You are full of deceit," he said. "A son of darkness, you twist truth into lies." Mark's breath caught. Paul raised his hand. "The Lord's hand is against you," he said. "You will be blind." Elymas opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He blinked once, twice, then stumbled backward. I can't see, he shouted. Someone, light a lamp. I can't see. Chaos erupted. The governor jumped to his feet. The guards reached for their swords, but Paul didn't move, and neither did Barnabas. Mark, on the other hand, was frozen. His hands were shaking. His knees, too. That afternoon, the governor was baptized in his own courtyard, smiling as servants poured water over his head. The entire household rejoiced. But Mark slipped away. He sat alone outside the city on the broken edge of a stone wall. The sea wind tugged at his cloak. He tried to breathe slowly to calm the pounding in his chest. He had seen something miraculous, but it hadn't made him feel strong. It made him feel small. Barnabas found him just after sunset. "You ran off," he said gently, sitting beside him. Mark didn't look up. "I needed air." Barnabas waited. Mark spoke again. "I thought this would be exciting. I thought I'd feel brave." "And do you?" "No," Mark whispered. "I feel like a child watching warriors." Barnabas looked toward the water. "Paul's bold, always has been. But boldness isn't the same as calling." Mark finally turned to him. "Do you think I made a mistake coming?" Barnabas didn't answer right away. He just reached over and placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "I think fear's loudest right before something important happens," he said. "Don't listen too closely." Mark tried to nod. He wanted to believe it. But something cold was growing in his chest. A voice that sounded a lot like his own, whispering, "You don't belong here. You'll never be like them. You're not ready." And part of him was starting to believe it. They left Cyprus before the week was over. Another ship, another coastline, another set of uncertain waves stretching toward the unfamiliar. Mark didn't speak much during the voyage to Perga, a city on the southern edge of Asia Minor. The ship was smaller than the first and the waters less forgiving. Barnabas offered him bread during one of the long silences, but Mark only took a bite before setting it down. He didn't feel seasick this time. He just felt tired. Tired of pretending to be brave. Tired of replaying Elymas's blindness in his head. Tired of wondering whether Paul had already decided he wasn't worth bringing. When they docked in Perga, the land was hot and dry, with mountains looming in the distance like giants that dared you to climb them. Paul stared at the hills like a man itching for war. "We go inland tomorrow," Paul said, tightening the straps on his bag. "Inland?" Mark asked, glancing toward the hills. "There's no road." "There's a path," Paul replied. "Rough, steep, but the gospel doesn't wait for comfort." Mark stayed quiet. His sandals were already worn, his feet blistered. The thought of climbing into unknown territory with men who didn't question a single step made his stomach twist. Barnabas leaned toward him later that evening. "You holding up?" "I'm not sure," Mark admitted. "It's harder than I thought." Barnabas gave a soft chuckle. "It always is." They ate what little they had left: dried fish, flatbread, lukewarm water. Paul spent the evening praying out loud in the corner of the stone hut they borrowed from a local believer. Mark listened to every word. But the more Paul prayed, the smaller Mark felt. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He just didn't see himself in their future. He wasn't Paul the preacher. He wasn't Barnabas the encourager. He was just the boy who carried scrolls and carried doubts even more. Before sunrise, Mark stood at the shoreline with his bag slung over one shoulder. His sandals were tied. His eyes were red. He waited in silence, listening to the sound of the waves behind him. Barnabas found him first. "You're not coming," he said quietly. Mark looked down. "I thought I could. I wanted to. But I'm not who you think I am." "Mark," Barnabas said, stepping closer, "we don't need you to be Paul, or perfect, or fearless." "I'm not even sure I want to do this anymore," Mark admitted, his voice cracking. "Not this way. Not with people staring, not with the danger, not with Paul expecting me to run when I don't even know if I can walk." A long silence passed between them. Then Barnabas asked, "Are you walking away from the mission, or from the Lord?" Mark didn't know how to answer that. I need to go home." And Barnabas, though his face was full of sorrow, nodded. He didn't try to stop him. Paul came outside a few minutes later, ready for the journey. When he saw Mark standing at the edge of the road, he frowned. "What's this?" Barnabas answered first. "He's going back." Paul's eyes hardened. "Back to Jerusalem?" Mark nodded slowly. Paul didn't say goodbye, didn't offer prayer. He turned without a word, adjusted the scrolls on his back, and walked away toward the mountains. Barnabas gave Mark a long, unreadable look. Then he followed. And Mark watched them disappear over the first hill before turning toward the sea, heart pounding and hands shaking with the shame of quiet failure following every step. Mark had never known a walk could feel so heavy. It wasn't the weight of his bag, though the scroll case thudded against his side with every step and his sandals rubbed the same raw spot on his heel until it stung. No, it was something deeper than that. A kind of weight that settled in the chest, slow and sticky like regret that refused to loosen its grip. The journey back to Jerusalem was long and quiet. The roads were dusty, the inns unfamiliar, the travelers along the way uninterested in conversation. Mark didn't blame them. He didn't feel much like talking either. He kept thinking about that moment, Paul's silence, the disappointment in Barnabas's eyes. He had expected anger or maybe a lecture, but what stung worse than anything was the absence of words. No goodbye, no we'll see you soon. Just the quiet, sharp edge of being left behind. More than once, Mark looked over his shoulder, half wondering if they'd come running after him. They never did. By the time he reached Jerusalem, he didn't feel like the same boy who'd left. The house looked just like it had. His mother opened the door with a smile that froze halfway when she saw the look in his eyes. "You're home early," she said gently. Mark nodded and stepped past her, dropping his bag in the corner of the courtyard. She didn't press him, not that day. She just set out bread, warm water, and a folded cloak he hadn't realized he missed. That night, he lay on his back staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the silence of his own heart. It should have been comforting to be home, to be safe. But all he could think was, "You didn't finish. You didn't fight. You quit." When his mother finally asked what happened, he gave a small shrug. "I wasn't ready." She didn't argue. She just nodded, brushed his hair with her hand, and said, "You're still his." But Mark wasn't so sure. Weeks passed, then months. The stories of Paul and Barnabas continued without him. Rumors of healings, salvations, whole cities turning to Christ. People talked about it over bread, prayed about it during gatherings. Sometimes they'd glance at Mark and go quiet, like they didn't know what to say. And Mark? He stayed behind. He helped copy scrolls. He swept the same floors. He delivered food to widows, bandaged skinned knees, and passed out bread in the upper room. He never complained, not out loud, but something in him grew quieter each day. What's the point of being part of the church, he thought, if you already failed the only job you were trusted with? One evening, Peter returned to Jerusalem. His beard was longer, and there were more creases around his eyes, but his presence still filled the room like fire in a lamp. He found Mark near the back after dinner, sorting through scrolls on a bench. "Still organizing the kingdom, are we?" Peter said with a grin. Mark smiled weakly. "Somebody has to." Peter didn't respond right away. He sat beside him, arms crossed, face thoughtful. "Barnabas told me what happened," he said gently. Mark's stomach sank. Peter went on. "He said you left, that Paul didn't take it well." "I didn't take it well either," Mark said softly. Peter's voice lowered. "Let me tell you something. The night Jesus was arrested, I swore I'd never leave him. I swore with fire in my chest and thunder in my voice. And then a little servant girl asked if I knew him, and I said no. 3 times. Mark didn't move. "I failed loud," Peter said. "You failed quiet. Either way, we both know what it's like to walk away." Mark blinked fast. "But you came back." Peter gave a gentle laugh. "So will you." By the time another year passed, Mark had settled into the rhythm of being useful. Not impressive, not important, but useful. He was the kind of person who showed up early and stayed late, made copies of Paul's letters for the churches, made sure widows didn't go hungry, and knew how to fix a cracked oil lamp without anyone noticing it had ever been broken. People stopped talking about why he came home early, at least not to his face. And he had almost made peace with the idea that maybe this was his role, background support, a quiet helper in the shadows of giants. But then Barnabas showed up again. Mark was in the courtyard sharpening a quill when his uncle stepped through the gate, brushing dust off his travel cloak. "You're back." Mark stood quickly. "How was Lystra?" "Still limping from that one," Barnabas said with a grin. "The stones there are sharp." Mark winced. They tried to stone Paul again? Barnabas nodded. Didn't stop him. He was preaching by nightfall. Mark smiled, but something inside him stirred. He had missed it. The stories, the fire, the danger and wonder of the road. Barnabas saw it in his face. "That hunger never really goes away," he said softly. Mark looked down at the half-finished letter in his lap. "Sometimes I wish it would." Later that evening, over bread and lentils, Barnabas leaned forward. "I want you to come with us again." Mark froze. "What?" "Paul and I are planning another journey, back through the cities where the churches started. Encouragement, teaching. We need more hands, more hearts, and I want you." Mark's throat tightened. "Even after last time?" "You've grown," Barnabas said. "I've seen it. You're not the same boy who left." Mark wasn't sure what to say. Part of him wanted to shout yes. Another part said, "Not until Paul agrees." So he asked, "Does Paul know you're asking me?" The answer came 3 days later in Antioch. The plan had been simple. Barnabas and Paul would pray, gather supplies, and begin their next journey. Mark stayed quiet as they met in the courtyard outside the house church. Paul spotted him immediately. He didn't smile. Barnabas got straight to the point. "I want to bring Mark." Paul crossed his arms. "No." Barnabas didn't flinch. "He's ready." Paul's voice stayed calm. "He left us in Perga. He quit when the mission got hard." "He was young," Barnabas said. "He's not the same." "He wasn't faithful," Paul replied, "and I won't gamble with the work God gave us." Mark felt the words like a slap across the face. He wanted to defend himself, but the worst part was Paul wasn't wrong. He had left. Barnabas turned to Mark for a moment, then looked back at Paul. Grace makes room for growth. Paul shook his head. Not this time. The silence after that was thick. Barnabas turned to Mark, eyes gentle. Then we'll go our own way. Mark's heart pounded. Wait, you mean? I'll go with you, Barnabas said. Back to Cyprus, back to the beginning. If Paul doesn't want you, then we go where grace does. Mark stood speechless. He hadn't asked for this, but he had been chosen. That night, Paul and Silas packed up their scrolls and left toward Syria, and Mark stood by the fire as Barnabas scribbled plans on a worn map, the flames casting shadows across his face. Two paths had opened, one slammed shut, and one had been carved just for him. The sky over Cyprus was blinding blue as the ship pulled into the harbor, but Mark didn't see it the same way he had the first time. The salty wind tugged at his cloak, the dockhand shouted, but in his chest, something sat heavy. This wasn't a grand comeback. There were no crowds waiting, no trumpets sounding, no Paul standing beside him like a brother in arms. Just Barnabas. And silence. He tried not to flinch when his feet hit the stone dock. This was the very place he'd walked before, brimming with excitement, carrying scrolls and dreams he thought would last forever. But this time, he stepped carefully, like every stone might remember his failure. That night, Barnabas stood in the synagogue of Salamis and preached with fire in his voice. Mark sat in the back, half taking notes, half watching the door. Would someone recognize him? Would someone whisper, "Isn't that the boy who ran?" But no one did. And somehow, that was worse. After the gathering, Barnabas was surrounded, people hungry for healing, prayer, wisdom. Mark helped hand out bread, passed water jars down the line. He smiled, nodded, answered softly. And then a woman grabbed his wrist. "You're Barnabas's helper, aren't you?" she said. Mark nodded. "I try to be." Her voice dropped. "I heard about the boy who left Paul, the one who gave up." His breath caught. Before he could speak, she added, "I hope you're not him, because my son's listening now, and if you quit again, he might think it's okay to do the same." She let go and vanished into the crowd. Mark stood there, frozen. The cup in his hand trembled. Later he found Barnabas sitting under a fig tree, sharpening his blade and humming. "You ever feel like people want you to be someone you're not?" Mark asked. "All the time," Barnabas said. "Usually Paul." Mark gave a half laugh, then his face hardened. "A woman said she hoped I wasn't the boy who left." Barnabas looked up. "And what did you say?" "Nothing." "You didn't deny it?" "I didn't have to. She already decided." Barnabas leaned back, voice calm. "Let me tell you something, Mark. You'll meet people who only remember you for your worst moment. You can't argue with them into believing in your change. You have to live it long enough that even your enemies run out of stories." Mark clenched his jaw. "What if they're right?" Barnabas paused. "Then the only way to prove them wrong is to stay." In Paphos, things took a turn. They had just finished praying in a courtyard when a man shoved his way forward, a former disciple of Elymas, the same sorcerer Paul had blinded. "You're with the Nazarene preachers?" the man asked, voice sharp. Barnabas stepped forward. "Yes." The man's eyes narrowed. "I saw what your friend did to Elymas," He made him blind, cursed him. That wasn't from God. Mark's chest tightened. He remembered Elymas's scream, the way Paul's voice had thundered with authority. Your teacher uses fear, the man growled. That's not truth. That's control. Barnabas kept his voice steady. Elymas was leading people into darkness. And now he sits in it, the man hissed. Forever. He stormed away. Mark stared at Barnabas. Do you ever wonder if Paul went too far? Barnabas didn't flinch. I wonder all the time. That's why we need more than just fire. We need light. We need people who don't run from truth, but also don't forget grace. Mark swallowed hard. He had always wanted Paul's fire, but maybe God had something else in mind. The next day, a boy followed Mark out of the gathering, 12, maybe 13, dusty-faced and full of questions. Is it true you traveled with Paul? He asked, wide-eyed. I did, Mark said slowly. Why aren't you with him now? Mark hesitated. Because I made a mistake. The boy frowned. Did he forgive you? Mark opened his mouth, paused, then said, Not yet. The boy nodded thoughtfully. Then I'll pray he does. He took off running, sandals slapping the road, a tiny whirlwind of sincerity and hope. Mark stood there, stunned. A child had just believed in him more than Paul ever did. That night, under a sky smeared with stars, Mark stood at the edge of the village with his hands in his cloak and his heart thudding in his chest. Maybe he'd never be Paul. Maybe he'd never preach like Barnabas. But he could stay. He could serve. He could keep walking even if his legs still remembered the time he ran. The crowds came and went. The scrolls were copied and delivered. The prayers were whispered through cracked doorways, sometimes answered, sometimes not. And as the months passed, something strange happened to Mark. He disappeared. Not in the physical sense, he was still there. Still setting up benches before gatherings, still boiling water for the sick, still translating letters when someone couldn't read the Greek. But in the eyes of others, he faded. His name wasn't on the lips of preachers. No one asked him to speak. The firebrand boy who had once sailed with Paul was now just Mark, the quiet helper. It would have been easy to grow bitter, easy to sulk in the corners of the churches, arms folded, heart wounded, but instead, Mark listened. He listened to the widows talk about their lost husbands. He listened to children sing in the marketplaces. He listened to merchants curse the rising taxes and still offer free bread to the poor. And slowly, without anyone noticing, something in him began to grow stronger. Not louder, not flashier, just deeper. In one town, a small church met in the cellar of an abandoned spice shop. The walls were stained with old cinnamon dust. The smell lingered in every cloak. Mark had come with Barnabas to drop off scrolls and help train 2 new leaders, but when they arrived, they found fear instead of joy. The leader of the church, a young man named Damar, had been arrested just days before. His wife Lyria met them at the door with eyes too tired for her age. They say he'll be held until someone speaks for him, she whispered, but no one dares. Barnabas said nothing, but Mark stepped forward. Where is he? Lyria's lips parted. You would go? I'll go, Mark said. The jail was small, more of a glorified cage with a roof. The guards weren't looking for trouble. In fact, they didn't even glance at Mark when he entered, scrolls tucked in his robe like any other errand boy. When Damar saw him, his face lit up. Barnabas came? No, Mark said quietly. Just me. The man's hope flickered. "I'm not Paul," Mark added. "I'm not going to break the chains or make the walls shake, but I can sit with you. I can tell them you're not a threat. I can write your statement if you're too tired to speak." DeMar sat down slowly, as if the weight of fear was heavier than any shackle. And Mark did exactly what he promised. No miracles, no fire, just quiet courage. By the time they left that town, DeMar had been released. Lyria wept into Mark's cloak as she thanked him. Barnabas, watching from across the road, simply nodded. Later, around a cooking fire, Barnabas said, "I didn't expect you to volunteer." Mark poked the fire with a stick. "I didn't either." Barnabas gave a small smile. "You don't need a stage to carry the gospel." "I'm starting to see that." Years passed that way, quietly, faithfully. Mark became the one people turned to for copies of Scripture, for guidance on difficult Greek verses, for prayers that didn't make a show but always left you feeling heard. There were no dramatic dreams, no visions, no sea voyages, just town after town, face after face, need after need. And Mark, once a runner, stayed through all of it. Then one day, a knock came at the door. Not at midnight, like Peter's, not during a prayer meeting. Just a simple knock, mid-morning, while Mark was writing out a section from Isaiah. He opened it and found a man with a dust-covered satchel and sweat on his brow. "I bring word from Rome," the man said, "from a doctor named Luke." Mark's heart skipped. Luke, Paul's friend, the one who traveled with him after Silas, the one who wrote with careful detail and listened like a historian. The messenger handed Mark a folded parchment. Inside were just a few lines. "Paul is imprisoned again. He asked for you. He says, 'Mark is useful to me in the ministry. Bring him, if you can.'" Mark stared at the words, heart pounding. Paul wants me." Mark must have read the letter 10 times before he moved. The parchment was small, folded, worn, smudged at the edges, but the words? They struck like thunder in his chest. "Mark is useful to me in the ministry. Bring him if you can." Paul had written that. Paul. The same man who once refused to let him come. The same man who turned without a word when Mark walked away. Now, after all this time, after all the silence and distance, Paul wanted him. Mark didn't cry, not right away. But his hands trembled as he pressed the parchment flat on the table. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at it. His mind ran circles around the question that now refused to leave him alone. Why now? Barnabas was gone, off encouraging another young leader in a new city. The house was quiet. Mark had the whole evening to himself. And yet, he couldn't sit still. He paced the courtyard. He rewrote his to-do list 3 times. He tried praying, but the words didn't come out right. And finally, he just said it aloud. "Why now, Paul?" Was it regret? Guilt? Did Paul need something only Mark could give, like a scroll or a translator? Or had something changed? Had Paul changed? He read the letter again. "Mark is useful to me." Those words hurt and healed all at once, because Paul hadn't said valuable or forgiven or loved, just useful. Still, it was more than nothing, and it was more than Mark ever expected. He left at dawn. Rome was far, weeks of travel through dusty cities and dangerous terrain. But he didn't hesitate. For once in his life, Mark didn't overthink it. He just packed his things, tucked the letter into his scroll case, and started walking. The journey gave him too much time to think. Every mile closer brought new doubts. What if Paul changed his mind? What if Mark showed up and Paul looked away again? What if this was a mistake? But with each step, those doubts grew quieter, not because they disappeared, but because something else had grown louder, hope. Not in himself, not even in Paul, but in what God had done in the quiet years. About halfway to Rome, he stopped in a village to spend the night. An elderly couple took him in. They didn't know who he was, just another traveler with tired eyes and a hunger for something warm. Over dinner, they asked about his journey. "I'm going to see someone I failed," Mark said. The husband paused mid-bite. "To make things right?" "I don't know if I can," Mark said honestly. "But he's asking for me now, and that means something." The old man nodded. "Then it means everything." Later that night, the woman handed him a fresh loaf of bread for the road. She tucked it into his pack and said, "Grace never calls us back just to shame us, only to restore." When Mark reached the city gates of Rome, the sky was dark with smoke from the forges. He tightened his grip on the scroll case and moved through the crowded streets. He followed the directions Luke had given, past vendors and beggars and temples carved from cold marble. When he finally reached the small building tucked behind a butcher's stall, he hesitated. This was it. The room where Paul, his former mentor, his judge, his friend, waited. Mark stood still for a long time, hand hovering above the door. Then quietly, he whispered a single prayer, "Lord, let him see who I've become, not who I was." The knock echoed louder in Mark's ears than it did against the wooden door. Once, twice, then silence. He held his breath, half hoping no one would answer, that he could walk away and say, "Well, I tried." But the door opened. It wasn't Paul, it was Luke, the doctor, calm eyes, ink-stained fingers, robe half-buttoned. He blinked, then tilted his head as if searching his memory. "Mark?" Luke said. Mark gave a slow nod. "You sent the letter." Luke's expression shifted instantly, like a door unlocking from the inside. He stepped forward and embraced him. No questions, no hesitation. "Come in," Luke said. "He's been waiting." The room was small, just one window with tired light spilling across a bench and a pile of worn scrolls. A thin curtain hung between two spaces. Behind it, Mark could hear faint coughs, raspy, dry, familiar. His chest tightened. Luke handed him a cup of water and nodded toward the curtain. He's older now. Slower. But still Paul. Mark looked down at the cup in his hands. "Do I just walk in?" Luke smiled gently. "He didn't ask for scrolls. He asked for you." Mark stepped forward slowly, brushing past the curtain with trembling fingers. There he was. Paul sat propped against a wall, legs wrapped in a blanket, shoulders thinner than Mark remembered. His beard had grayed, and there were deep lines around his mouth and eyes, like someone who had wrestled lions in his soul and lived to write about it. Paul turned his head. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. For a heartbeat, they just stared. Two men who had once shared a mission and a fracture. Mark tried to speak first, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "I came." Paul nodded once. "I see that." Silence again. Not angry, just heavy. Mark stepped closer. "You wrote that I was useful." Paul nodded again. "You are." Mark swallowed hard. "But I wasn't. Back then. I wasn't ready. I left. I disappointed you." Paul looked at him, eyes softening. "I've disappointed people too." Mark blinked. He hadn't expected that. Paul motioned for him to sit. Mark lowered himself onto a stool across from him, still gripping the water like a shield. "I used to think the only people worth trusting were the ones who never failed," Paul said. "But prison has a way of reminding you God builds his church with people who break." Mark looked down. "So why ask for me now?" Paul smiled faintly. "Because I finally saw what Barnabas saw. You didn't quit the gospel, Mark. You just had to learn how to walk again." Tears threatened to surface, but Mark blinked them back. He wanted to say something meaningful, something powerful, but all that came out was "thank you." Paul reached forward and placed a weathered hand over Mark's. "I don't need an apology," he said. "I need a brother." For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't a wall, it was peace. Two men, two stories, one God who refused to let failure be the end. Mark stayed longer than he expected. At first, just for the night, then the next, then the week. He helped sweep the dust from the corners of Paul's cell. He brought fresh parchment when Paul's hands were strong enough to write. He poured water into a cracked basin and cooled Paul's fevered head when the Roman summer pressed too heavy on the stone walls. No one had officially assigned him the job, but grace had, and this time he wasn't running from it. Late one evening, Paul asked for a scroll. Mark found one at the foot of the bed, rolled neatly next to Luke's ink jar. As he passed it over, Paul's voice broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't left?" Mark hesitated. "All the time." Paul exhaled slowly. "Me too." Mark set the scroll beside him. "But I think about something else more." Paul looked up. "I think about how much I would have missed if I never came back." The words hung between them for a moment, gentle and sharp at the same time. Paul gave a slow smile. "That's a better thought." A few days later, a messenger arrived. Another young man, out of breath, sandals half untied. He brought news from one of the churches in Galatia. A leader had fallen. Arguments had broken out, and the congregation was split. Paul groaned, sat up straighter, and waved for Mark. Dictation time. Mark grabbed a scroll and a fresh quill, settling beside him. "What are we saying?" he asked, dipping the tip in ink. Paul rubbed his forehead. "Something strong, but full of grace." Mark nodded, already writing. "Brothers, if anyone is caught in a transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him gently." Paul paused, then added, "Make sure you write that part clearly. Gently." Mark didn't say it out loud, but the word pierced his heart. He had been restored that way, not by lectures, not by anger, but by a steady hand and the grace to try again. That night they ate together near the small fire Luke had built. Paul didn't have much appetite anymore, but he still asked for stories, what the churches were like now, who was still faithful, how Barnabas was doing. Mark told him about the widow in Salamis who gave him figs every week, just in case you looked hungry, and the young boy in Paphos who still believed Paul had superpowers. Paul chuckled at that. "Let's not tell him how many times I cried behind closed doors." Mark smirked. "It wouldn't sell as many scrolls." For a while they just laughed. Then the laughter faded, and Paul looked up at him, not with the eyes of a teacher or a commander, but of a friend. "I'm glad you came, Mark." Mark looked into the fire. "So am I." The years had aged Paul, carved lines into his face, weakened his bones. But in that moment, Mark saw something more powerful than Paul's sermons or miracles. He saw humility. He saw a man who once demanded perfection, now extending grace. He saw a man who had changed and had given Mark space to change too. As the fire burned low and the sounds of Rome faded into the night, Mark whispered one final thought aloud. "I'm not the boy who ran anymore." Paul nodded, eyes heavy but bright. "No, you're the man who came back." Rome felt colder that week, not in weather, but in spirit. The guards didn't laugh as much, the streets near the prison grew tense, and every whisper that passed through the bars seemed to carry the same shadow. The trial is over, the execution is coming soon. Mark knew it, so did Luke. Even Paul had stopped pretending it was far away. One morning, while the sky was still painted gray, Paul stirred early and called out softly, "Mark?" Mark sat up immediately, pulling his cloak around his shoulders. "I'm here." Paul turned his head, voice barely more than a breath. "Bring me the scrolls, the old ones, the ones I wrote in Ephesus, and some parchment." Mark lit the lamp, heart already racing. "Are you writing another letter?" Paul gave a tired smile. "The last one." The air in the room changed. Mark spread the scrolls across the ground. His fingers trembled slightly as he unrolled them, letters that had once traveled city to city, encouraging saints, rebuking sin, planting truth into the bones of new believers. Now they were fragile from use, edges worn, ink faded, but every word pulsed with purpose. Paul sat up straighter than he had in days. "Timothy needs to know the truth," he said, "before they forget what this all meant." Mark readied his quill. Paul began to speak. It didn't sound like a letter at first. It sounded like a father speaking to a son. "I have fought the good fight," Paul said. Mark wrote each word carefully, afraid to blink. "I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." He paused, looked up. But Paul didn't stop. "There is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord will award to me on that day." Mark's throat was tight. He wanted to stop writing. He wanted to shout, "No, not yet." But Paul's eyes were clear, and his voice had never sounded more alive. "Write this next," Paul said quietly. "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in the ministry." Mark's hand froze. He stared at the page, ink dripping from his quill. "You mean you want that in the letter for Timothy to read?" Paul nodded. "I want everyone to know, not just you. I want the church to know that I saw you rise again." For a moment Mark couldn't speak. He set the quill down, pressed his hand to his forehead. "I didn't think I'd ever hear that from you," he admitted. Paul looked at him, eyes soft. "I know." Mark leaned forward, voice cracking. "Do you forgive me, Paul?" Paul didn't hesitate. "Mark, I need you. That's more than forgiveness." Mark felt something inside him release, something that had been chained up since Perga. He didn't know if it was shame or fear or pride. He just knew it was finally gone. Later that day, Paul reached beneath his sleeping mat and pulled out an old, weathered scroll. He handed it to Mark without a word. Mark opened it carefully. It was Paul's original copy of his first letter to the Corinthians. "The love chapter," Paul said with a small smile. "The one I rewrote 5 times before I sent it." Mark ran his fingers across the familiar words. Love is patient. Love is kind. Paul's voice was hoarse. "I want you to keep it." Mark looked up. You want me to keep this? Paul nodded. It's yours now. You've earned it, not by being perfect, but by coming back. Mark sat beside him, scroll in his lap, heart pounding. He'd been entrusted with something more than paper. He'd been entrusted with legacy. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He lit a small candle and sat in the corner with a blank scroll. For a long time, he just stared at it. Then he dipped his quill into ink and wrote, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." He didn't write his name at the top, because this story wasn't about him. It was about grace that finds runaways, about second chances, about a Savior who calls cowards, failures, and quiet helpers and turns them into storytellers. The days after that were quieter, but not because there was nothing left to say. It was the silence of sacred things, the kind that follows holy ground. Paul was resting more, speaking less. But when he did speak, Mark listened like he was catching every breath of a fading comet. Mark spent most mornings copying Paul's letters, preparing them for delivery to churches that had never even met him. But now, as he worked, something shifted. The words no longer felt like someone else's story. They felt like his. Every phrase Paul had written about grace, endurance, weakness, and restoration, Mark had lived it. Every warning about pride, every charge to stay the course, it all pulsed with new meaning in his chest. He had once run from this mission. Now he couldn't imagine anything else. Luke noticed the change, too. "You sit straighter," Luke said one afternoon, pouring water into a clay bowl. "I do?" "You do," Luke said. "Your voice is stronger, too, like it knows it belongs." Mark smiled faintly. "Maybe it finally believes it." Luke set down the pitcher. "Have you told Paul you're writing?" Mark's eyes drifted toward the corner where a blank scroll lay hidden beneath his cloak. "I haven't told anyone," he admitted. "Why?" Mark paused. "Because it still feels strange to think I have something worth saying." Luke raised an eyebrow. "You don't have something to say because you're important, Mark. You have something to say because he is." That night, Mark took out the scroll. He sat alone by the flickering oil lamp, the same one he'd refilled every night for Paul. The flame danced shadows across the stone wall, and his quill hovered above the parchment. Not out of fear this time, but reverence. Then in a slow and steady hand, he began to write again. "As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, 'Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way.'" And with every word, memories returned. He saw John the Baptist crying out in the wilderness. He saw Jesus healing hands on the Sabbath, turning over tables in the temple, weeping in Gethsemane. He saw Peter's wide eyes the night the prison door opened, and his own smaller eyes peeking from behind a curtain, too afraid to cheer. He saw his younger self packing scrolls with shaking fingers, boarding a boat with dreams too heavy for his shoulders. And he saw the road back, the prison cell, the parchment in his hand. By the time the candle had burned down to a stub, he had written 3 full columns. They weren't perfect. Some lines scratched out, some ink smudged, but they were real. And they were his. No one had assigned him this task. No church commission, no formal announcement. But grace had called him to tell the story, and grace had earned that right in his life. The next morning, Paul was weaker. His hands trembled as he reached for the edge of his blanket. Mark helped him sit up slowly. Paul looked at him with tired but peaceful eyes. "You've got ink on your fingers," he said. Mark blinked, caught off guard. I've been writing." Paul gave a small, approving smile. "Good, don't stop." Mark hesitated. "It's not a letter, it's bigger. It's the whole story, beginning to end." Paul nodded. "The world will need it." Mark felt tears rising but didn't let them fall. Instead, he whispered, "I'll carry it." Paul reached out one last time and placed a hand over Mark's. "You already are." It happened quietly. No announcement, no trumpet, no crowd. Just the faint sound of Paul's final breath slipping from a life well poured out. Mark was there. He sat at Paul's side, one hand resting on the old man's shoulder, the other gripping the corner of a scroll they'd written together just days before. The light outside the window was soft that morning, slanting across the wall like the last brushstroke of a masterpiece. Mark didn't cry at first. He just sat there, still, listening. Not for more words from Paul, but for what God might say next. Luke handled the burial arrangements. There were few believers in Rome bold enough to be seen near the prison, but one old merchant offered a space on his land outside the city. Quiet, humble, fitting. Mark helped carry the body. He helped lower it. He helped cover it with the same dirt that had once buried his fear. And when it was done, he stayed behind. Just him and the wind. He knelt, hands covered in dust, heart swollen with something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not the kind that erases grief, but the kind that redeems it. Later that week, as Mark prepared to leave Rome, Luke found him in the room where Paul used to sleep. "So what now?" Luke asked. Mark looked up from his pack, then reached beneath his cloak and pulled out the scroll, the one he'd written by lamplight, filled with the words Peter had shared, filled with Jesus. "I finished this." Luke smiled. "You know, of all the people who could tell his story, God chose you." Mark nodded slowly. "Not because I never failed." "No," Luke said, "because you did, and got back up." Mark returned to the churches eventually. He spoke in small homes, in dusty courtyards, in synagogues filled with new believers and nervous doubters. He told them the gospel, not like a scholar, but like someone who had been caught by it, rescued by it, rewritten by it. And always, somewhere in the story, he would say, "There was a time I walked away." He never left that part out. Because that was the part where most people leaned in closer. That was the part that proved grace was real. Years passed, decades. And long after Mark was gone, copies of the scroll he wrote kept traveling from village to village, nation to nation. They read it out loud in hidden churches. They whispered it to their children in secret, and it always began the same way. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. No one remembered the name of the ship captain who brought Mark back to Cyprus, or the guard who slammed the prison door in Rome, or the woman who once said, "I hope you're not the one who quit." But they remembered Mark, the boy who once walked away from his calling, then returned to carry the gospel in his hands.